Hi and welcome. I'm Sarah Whiting. I'm Dean of Harvard's Graduate School of Design. First, just a quick reminder about some features you'll see in this Zoom webinar. The chat function has been disabled so that we can all focus on Emmanuel's presentation today. Emmanuel will respond to questions after he's finished his talk. You, the audience, are welcome to send questions to him at any time during the lecture by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We also have a live captioner providing captions during this event. You can enable the captions by clicking on closed caption, also at the bottom of the screen. Before I turn things over to Emmanuel, I want to invite you to join us for some upcoming GSD public programs. All lectures will happen on Zoom, and each one requires you to register in advance. More information about these events, as well as how to register, is available on the GSD's website. So this Saturday, China GSD is hosting a timely symposium as the world continues to grapple with the pandemic. While people can't gather in large groups, public space is nonetheless playing a greater role than ever in our cities. The symposium, entitled "What Are We Talking About When We're Talking About Public Space?" features, among others, George Thomas, Susan Snyder, and Gerald Caden, who was in the New York Times last week. Also, please join us this Monday, October 5th, for a lecture by Amsterdam-based artists and designers Mette Haven, during which they'll explore affinities between sensing and cinematic capture in the present moment. Then on Tuesday, October 6th, we'll hear from Charles Davis, who will introduce an anti-racist framework for architectural history that guided the formulation of his recent monograph, Building Character: The Racial Politics of Modern Architectural Style. Additionally, on Thursday, October 8th, we have a lot of events next week. Urban scholar Edgar Pieterse will join us to discuss new kinds of city-based institutions in Africa that promote experimentation, learning, and testing. Pieterse's lecture kicks off our year-long celebration of the Loeb Fellowship's Golden Jubilee, its 50th birthday. The Loeb Fellowship was endowed by John and Frances Loeb as a direct response to the challenges that the American city faced in 1968. The Loeb's goal in creating this fellowship was to bring highly promising original thinkers from the realms of the built and natural environment to the GSD for a year, challenging these people to do more and do better, convinced that they would return to their work with new ideas and new energy. And that brings me to the introduction of today's speaker, Emmanuel Pratt, who was a 2017 Loeb Fellow here at the GSD and was named as a MacArthur Fellow just last year. Emmanuel is an ideal example of what the Loebs intended with the fellowship. Arriving in Chicago in 2003, after graduating with his Master of Architecture and Urban Design from Columbia, he found a city beset by problems of racism, poverty, and crime, particularly in the neighborhood where he chose to live, Englewood, on Chicago's South Side. Englewood, which covers about 3 square miles, is a neighborhood whose population is in dramatic decline. It's currently around 26,000 people, but it had almost 5 times that population 50 years ago. The neighborhood's population is 95% Black, and the neighborhood has a reputation of being Chicago's murder capital, with daily shootings and more homicides than any other Chicago neighborhood. What you'll hear about in today's talk is one of the most ambitious responses I know of to a context like this one. I often talk about design's synthetic nature. We drop into situations and we're tasked with trying to tie together social, economic, political, technical, infrastructural, formal, and spatial considerations. That's hard. But what Emmanuel will show us today is that it is possible for design to be a catalyst for change. The Sweetwater Foundation's design contribution directly employs our 3 major disciplines of architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning, and design. But further, it offers a plan for community engagement, advocacy, and advancement through education, governance, commerce, and arts and culture. I invite you to listen to Emmanuel today and to learn from him how not to shy from the seemingly insurmountable challenges that we face in our cities today, so that you too can do more and do better. And finally, on a personal note, I'd like to thank Emmanuel for challenging me to do more and do better as I and we take on the hard work of seeing, understanding, and overturning the structural racism that underlies our institution. I look forward to Emmanuel's talk today and to many more conversations, both easy and difficult, over the years to come. Thank you, Emmanuel, for bringing us today to Chicago's South Side.
Thank you so much for the that introduction and also the opportunity to be here. I don't take this moment or this opportunity lightly. If you know anything about me, you will understand how deeply invested this work is. We have a common misconception of people say, oh, it's a nice project. And I usually snip back real quickly that this is my life. It's not a project. And then so in lies the conversation. At this moment, a critical moment in history, in the world, I look at this as an opportunity to be more of a historical record, to be on record with a truth and an undeniable truth that is often neglected, and hold institutions accountable for their role in previous histories of supporting an old paradigm and having an opportunity to change and shift that paradigm moving forward. So the framework for the talk today is coming about because of the dialogue that I've had with Sarah, and I greatly appreciate an open, honest dialogue about what the role of institutions and the profession should be moving forward. So with no further ado, how do we reconstruct real estate? What does reconstruct even mean? In an era where words and facts don't seem to matter, they increasingly matter for me and for all of the network of humans that we work with on a daily basis. Reconstruct, from the definition, just to use it, I look at this, it's interesting because it's three different frames. It's to build and build again, build anew, which people tend to know. Let's see. I have a technical, let's see, share. There we go. The frame reconstruct, what does it mean? To build and to construct, or to build it anew or build it again. But it's interesting from a medical perspective. It means to heal. And then from an academic lens, it also means to do the research required in order to understand how to reimagine and rebuild. From the real estate world, real estate tends to mean something along the lines of property or buildings and land. But increasingly, real estate is finding its way into digital spaces, especially the more we use digital technologies for storing data. We're looking for where real estate can be held. And increasingly, it's finding a blend between on the ground, old warehouses that need to be constantly cooled with water as a scarce resource. But what does it mean to reconstruct real estate? But ultimately is the question of value. Value we have to look at from the two different lenses, I think. There's a traditional monetary value, how much something is worth, what's the price of it, which has caused serious issues of crisis of capital, versus an ethic, versus a moral compass, versus a principle. Increasingly, we're finding this clash of values that we find in both the political landscape and the real estate landscape and the community development questions. So again, when being asked to share this presentation with the Harvard GFD, I took a step back and I was looking at what is the landscape of the pedagogical modes here? What is the ethos that's driving this equation? And it always astounds me of how many different lenses through which we can look at the built environment. And Sarah said, there's architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning, but increasingly we're addressing, and we should be addressing, the public health crisis and the climate crisis. And given the sociological downfall of what's happening within our democracy, we have to pay closer attention and be more accountable to do better, to create an actual collective future. So again, when you think about the city is the context of these conversations about how to design a collective future. What is the role of design? It's not, well, far too often it has been the rule of law of capital and money has been driving the derivation of what the city means. So I share from Chicago. Typically, Chicago is thought of in this picture perfect postcard moment of the stadium, the skyline. It is an absolutely amazing, beautiful top city, global city. It has a symbology in its architecture that has a deep, rich history, good, bad, and ugly. But the reification of capital as the downtown, is a gathering space by the water, as a of flows for tourism. There has been this challenge in the real estate world of this: how do you move forward in architecture with this complexity of abstraction versus representation, where we have the real and we have the technology now that allows for us to render visions for a potential future. And increasingly the aesthetic and the material lens reflects an approach towards capital and return on investment that has created and reinforced class status, has reinforced who the audience is intended for and not. These kind of fictional utopian scenes of where everything is perfect. But again, for who? The language and articulation of the representation is something that is high fashion, glossy, and it removes away. It's reductive of the social nature of how cities actually work, the ecology of how cities actually work. To the point where we have these buildings of the past. This is an example of the old post office. It's 40 acres of property, 40 acres equivalent of land. And it's stuck and frozen in time because its program has been outmoded, outdated. So there's these utopian visions of, well, we can make it a green space. We can now again introduce this glass aesthetic to somehow make it relevant and mask the actual history. Increasingly, there's new language that's looking at ecology and its role is for urban development. So there's been discussions of biomorphic urbanism. And the challenge with that is, again, who is this for? And unfortunately, a lot of times, a lot of proposals are greenwashed with language that sounds like it's for all. It sounds like it should be for all and for the earth and for the planet. But when you take a closer look and you look at how it's inserted within the cityscape, it still falls back into traditional approaches towards development for capital in select neighborhoods that are chosen for select audiences. Sadly, Chicago is not alone, but we have these vehicles in the DNA of how cities work that reinforce this. So TIF, tax incremental finances, $2 billion for one select project is questionable when you have an accelerated growth pattern. But it calls into question, what is the accountability framework for the design and a city by design? So if you go back and take a step back and look at the plan of Chicago, most are familiar with the Burnham Plan and the role Daniel Burnham Plan played in the design, but it's don't understand how it was commissioned by the commercial club for businesses outright. So the vision of it was, how do you create a structure to accelerate the business side of it? It's not designed for the social side of it. It's designed for an economy of leisure for those that have, but not necessarily for the diversity, given the lens of this in the 1890s. It has set forth a trajectory of how cities, particularly Chicago, have formed from 1900 to 2005. And what's fascinating is that if you actually look at the city of 77 neighborhoods over time and look at the evolution of it, the interplay of meaning that has played out across space and time, geographically, it tells you a different story. So Chicago, 1910, I'm just gonna flip through these relatively quickly. If you're looking at the red is where African Americans have historically moved to the city of Chicago. So from 1910 to 1960, 1970, 1980, and you see the stratification that geographically evolves on the south and west sides of Chicago. So this has become a focus and topic of a taxonomy of the transition. How did this happen? Why did this happen? And it's studied over and over again, how it affects vacancy rates, unemployment issues, poverty issues, quality of schools. Where does money invested into the city in order to support, and where is it not? Where is the municipal disinvestment? Where has it not been strategically over time, systematically neglected? To the point where we're looking at studies are saying your public health is determined by your zip code. It's such a problematic determinist outlook on life, but it is becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you live in a certain neighborhood or in a certain zip code, your chances of life are dwindling. So Englewood and Washington Park, for instance, have some of the lowest life expectancies in the city of Chicago today. So we have a landscape of uneven development that has created a tale of two cities. It is reinforced by facts in history, the designs of building for select audiences. And it unfortunately has been, Chicago's history has been challenged by the history of the projects, Stateway Gardens, Robert Taylor homes, that by design became structures of exclusion. And they became scarred and reiterated the concept of blight. Now, the question of blight is interesting because in the city context, people know it from urban decay and blight of a building, blight of a community, blight of property. But it's actually a term from paleontology and study of plants and botany of it's the death and decay of a crop so that it no longer sustains life. So to take that terminology and apply it to a building or a neighborhood is very, very, very problematic. And what it does is, again, it challenges the narrative of what the buildings can be. So oftentimes they're just erased. And it becomes a vicious cycle of an erasure and an aesthetic oppression that continually says, you are not valued. This is not to be valued. And it becomes a stigma reinforced to whoever lives there. But when the money runs out, then all of a sudden you have these buildings that are frozen in time. And it's not just one era. It's various typologies of housing, single family, multifamily, but the buildings remain. What people do not pay a proper attention to is the plunder and the loss from a particular population. So there was a recent study in Chicago about the loss of Black wealth, and it's $3.2 billion of wealth from racist practices between 1950 and 1970. $3.2 billion from these homeowners that was extracted from the community. But that's just one aspect of money. What is the effect? What is the root shock? What is the stress and post-traumatic stress of being evicted or losing your house or losing your community over and over and over for generations? So the real estate world actually has, one would argue, embraced the process of a paradigm of degeneration. Selective focus on capital in value and generation, but fundamentally it has been stratified and sucking processes of degeneration that create a prescriptive pathology of chronic urban problems, deterioration of housing and factories, chronic poverty, unemployment in select neighborhoods, health in audiences, health issues in environment. The unfortunate consequences of this also, since it's based on your taxes, cities are based on the taxes, that you are stripping away money and support for schools. So in Chicago years ago, we lost 49 schools. I think it ended up being 54, all at the same time. And you look at the map, here we go again. South and west sides predominantly impacted the most, in the same neighborhoods that were already losing infrastructure to support for the housing. And then you're left with these buildings that are just remnants of history, frozen in time again, that could be utilized. But they litter the landscape and become symbols of neglect or vacancy. And despite the cry from the families, from the communities, please don't close the schools. So the question of what is a neighborhood, what is education, what is jobs and sustainability in the future, what does that mean? And it causes the city to react, and developers in the city, Department of Planning and Development, what is the new plan for Chicago based on the old plan of Daniel Burnham? So unfortunately, when people go back to their tools of how they work and they operate, then you have this realization that majority of the empty lots and the vacancy is again on the south and west side, and it creates a new policy called the large lot program, got nicknamed the dollar lot program, where you can pick up an extra parcel for $1. But it sheds off of the portfolio that the city has too many empty lots that they own, which then incentivizes things like the opportunity zone, which are again predicated on a fundamental single bottom line value. It is not about the community or the residents. It is about making money and accelerating your development for single monetary gain. Unfortunately, and realistically, this is all based on the underwriting manual from 1936, where race and class was explicitly spelled out, that if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it's necessary that the properties shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. The change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to an instability and a reduction of values. And it was called out explicitly by race, which is informed by of why we have neighborhoods that are one value, one demographic predominantly, that is affiliated psychologically with some form of monetary value. So time and time again, we see this within the mayor's structures. But Frederick Douglass and Du Bois and George Washington Carver and Ida B. Wells have pushed back from this for so long. There's so many Black scholars, there's so many scholars of all different colors and backgrounds that have said there is no problem, and particularly in Chicago or in the African-American context, there's no Negro problem. The problem is whether American people have loyalty enough to really honor the Constitution upon which the United States is supposed to be built. This is actually super straight to the point. During his speech about the other America, Dr. King summed it up. Racism is based on an ontological affirmation. It is the notion that the very being of a people is inferior, and their ultimate logic of racism is genocide. So now we have Chicago that's been left into a series of segregations, a deep, rich history of segregation that is tantamount to South Africa's legacy of apartheid. And sadly, we've watched this be reinforced by the system, by the powers that be, by the political structure, by the current mayoral response to protect the real estate from protests from downtown, separate and cut off the rest of the city from access through the city, through the bridge structures, through the structures of the city, in order to protect the real estate first. So where do we go from here? It is absolutely time for a paradigm shift. And again, this is a historical record to share for now and moving forward. It is time for a paradigm shift. And the question is the question of value. We cannot continue to only look at a single bottom line reinforcement. We cannot do this. It is immoral, unethical. It is not what humans need, is not what the planet needs. So the real question is, what do you do with the lots? Especially when you have a prevalence of emptiness in hollowed out cities, not just in Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh, every major US city that has had this problem. So here's an example of a lot. It's not just a small lot, it's a 2-acre city block. It's an entire city block. And then there's only house. So upon research, find out that that house is featured in a real estate development article. Live like a land in Washington Park. So there's a question there because it's actually between Washington Park and Englewood. So it's being branded as being Washington Park so that it won't be starred in the real estate world, part of Englewood. But geographically, it sits right in the heart of Englewood and Washington Park. So this building and the land, why would you use the choice of the term live like a land? Where does that even come from? What's fascinating about that term is that it is from like the monopoly mindset. How do you turn $10,000 into $1 million? This is literally a game, land baron, for becoming a millionaire in the real estate world. The land baron term is from a feudal system where you have kings, bishops, barons, lords, knights, and peasants, and serfs, and from the most powerful to the least powerful. Where you create a system that reinforces privilege for the privileged and extracts away power and wealth for a select few. For a select few. So that's the mentality that's already embedded in this. How do you start? What do you do with this? Especially when it's labeled as a blight property, so there will not be returns on your investment. In the surrounding area, when you look at the lens, you look at the landscape, this is the property that's in the surrounding blocks. And in the greater context of decay. From an academic or from a research and a pedagogical lens, you say, well, you have to delimit the variables. You have to step back and understand what is the absentee ownership. And then you have a map. What's the city owned? Wow, majority of the city owned. So what's the main ethos of the development, or what's the path, what's the will of development when it's majority city owned? And then what's the age of the housing stock? These are the tools that we're often trying to use in architecture, urban planning. But it's an interesting narrative here. Majority of these houses are 1870 to 19, mainly 1900s. There's an ecology of absence. 79% of the area is vacant, 58% owned by the city, 24% absentee, and only 9% owned by residents that live in the neighborhood. Zoning is fascinating because it's of like there's commercial, there's manufacturing, there's residential. There's not there. When you actually look at the history of the site from 1895, the density, that was much more like city urban context, 1895 to 1926. But when the area started to be redlined by the homeowning loan corporation and the underwriting manual that explicitly said this area is virtually 100% Negro, and essentially it is plagued, then it is no surprise that when a conversion housing project in this same footprint got introduced and set the trajectory for its erasure to present. So 2012, more as an aerial shot, you see that it has been hollowed out. So that plague of redlining and mentality is both subliminal and superliminal. It is very unconscious, but also extremely conscious. That is now what you have to embrace, and in order to design. So again, in the traditional development world, or even in the pedagogy, a lot of times in the academic institutions, people will look at what is green and what's sustainable. That's the lens that we're looking now to how to rethink cities. So people look at green buildings. There's questions. How does this work? What is the scope of this design? What's the footprint? What's the life cycle over the course of the entire year? Food. Is this food? If you're just only growing lettuce and it's in an indoor environment and controlled light with actually just constantly using energy, and it's only lettuce, which if you actually think about it, it's actually a majority of water that you ship around the country and around the world, is this the right strategy? Because of the available land, a lot of development says, well, we have an opportunity for return on investment, some form of a campus. And unfortunately, a lot of those become enclosures of a common in order to control the population. So this is an example. Solar panels, green design, but for who? And who gets excluded? And ultimately, gardening becomes devalued because what's the return on investment with that? This has shaped our impact investment policies. This is informed how the development world will look at the opportunities, and also how cities look at the policies that reinforce traditional development patterns. Still have an empty lot in a foreclosed house, and a lot of other properties. So what do you do? So Sweetwater Foundation, founded over a decade ago. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the organization. Our talent is a neighborhood with a very specific intention of a different outlook of growth, not traditional development. We look at regenerative neighborhood development as a strategy to create safe and inspiring spaces for healthy intergenerational communities to transform the ecology of once blighted neighborhoods. And I say blighted because it's just a term people use, and we flip that on its head. We operate in the third sector, between the public and private sector. There is a social economy, there is an emergent adaptive response. And from generation to regeneration, and actually less of a focus on technology per se as automation. But actually, technology is a means to support and enhance communication, biomimetic informatic systems, so biologically informed information systems that inform our practice of art, architecture, agriculture, aquaponics. It's a mixed method of education and urban planning to rebuild. So just to give a little context, we started off in schools, looking at how to marry small-scale aquaponics and agriculture-inspired systems to science, technology, engineering, art, agriculture, and math. We call it STEAM A+. So a small-scale Tupperware, so a 28-quart, 56-quart one drill, using water bottles for ebb and flows, just inserting a small scale living system with the goldfish, but marrying it with our and doing monitoring systems. We started to captivate a lot of audiences that were otherwise neglected in schools. So we found other spaces in schools, classrooms that were populations in schools. So we work with principals, K through 8 high school, to just react with the students. And what we found is that the classroom literally became a living classroom, literally a living classroom with life. So with that reactivation and reconnection, we're looking at almost like an urban acupuncture type installation. How do you find the problem, identify a source of stress, and do insert a living solution to that stress? And we found his resonance. It was very intergenerational, not just kids, not just adults, young kids and elders. We started to remix the installations for art in non-traditional spaces, but they became classrooms, and they became opportunities to bring more and more diverse audiences together to share and reconnect. Ultimately, we started having a commentary on what is the future of the kitchen? What is the future of the restaurant if you can grow indoors and you have a real biomimetic informatics understanding of the water and the soil and the light and energy needed. So by translating that theory of change to outreach, neighborhood stabilization, find people through education, connected to learning, connected to life skills, to pilot projects to actually start building local economies, we then embarked onto that property that we were talking about. It used to be Mosley School for Social Reform, one of the worst schools in the history of Chicago. It used to be, until it became a homeless shelter, that then became a pipeline to prison, and then it was torn down and erased to leave a 2-acre hole in the neighborhood. So in 2010, you're looking at a hole, looking at the constant erasure that has been plaguing the neighborhood. We work with the city to farm, not a traditional return on investment. Most developers would think of it as a sinkhole for money and capital. There's an opportunity to engage the neighborhood, the neighbors, engage the humans, the residents, engage the natural systems to feed people and to educate feeding, and also look at healing as a foundational basis for why we're doing neighborhood development. Starting, I'm not worried about the production per acre, handshakes and social contracts and how new normals can be created. So when you walk outside, you have an abundance of kale and collards and chard and arugula and tomatoes, what have you. And then that inspires questions about property right across the street, which was the property that we looked at, was for $460,000 in 2007 and foreclosed for 31. Was on its path to be demolished. We embraced the opportunity, turned it into a canvas, literal canvas. So by creating a mural of the house, we then activated what we call the Think Do House. The Think Do House. We said, come on in. So populations would come in from various networks, from new networks, and then it started to education in the house as a community school. What was interesting is that finding people coming together around food that everyone eats started a range of different conversations that changed the aesthetic of the house on the inside. So we kept the aesthetic on the outside of the mural, but chalkboard paint, whiteboard paint, having people sit on the table, cooking classes, workshops around culinology and how do you have food medicine, culture and wisdom from the Great Migration, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Shared spaces and tinkering spaces in the basement for sharing knowledge, art projects inspired by nature. So Michelle, one of our extended team members, she teaches printmaking at Hyde Park Art Center, but having this as a space to engage youth, rethink nature and the patterns of nature, and then turn it into screen prints and hats and bags and fashion. The kale smoothie that became ever so popular so fast, being grown right outside with our squash musks. So what was amazing is that we had this high-end gourmet food, but right here in the neighborhood. And people ask why. We said, why not? What is it when this is the reality of what's possible? And what's beautiful is a new form of market, an actual interpersonal market where money was generated and supported locally. And people know what they pay for food. They know what they need to invest back into the neighborhood, which gives us the opportunity to do the designs that matter. So reclaiming the space that where the sidewalks are never finished, we inserted this multifunctional sculpture design for people to sit, eat, gather, right next to the market. And it begins to reframe the landscape, all of which is built from reclaimed lumber and material that is discarded and going to the landfills. So the field trip started to happen and the school trip started to happen, but with the elders in the neighborhood or with the grandparents. And this is pre-COVID. So we were generating a new form of a public by mixing audiences and having people remember, both remembering, but actually populating and remembering the neighborhood. So as an urban acupuncture installation, we said, let's take the house, the mural, the garden beds, and that area around the farm and look at how do we heal the history of erasure. With just being able to touch and grow the food and learning, sharing, having it become a destination point as a place to go, not just an empty space. So it's not uncommon to have field trips coming left and right. People asked to use the space for public events, gatherings. Most important is the shift in the ecology of the place. So we started to notice more native bees. We started honeybees, butterflies, monarch butterflies, different types of moths, praying mantis, grasshoppers, became the norm, which is amazing when you begin to interface with this every single day, and it changes your outlook on in sensitivity and awareness and ecological awareness of the importance of water and sunlight and certain types of plants and vegetables for the bees, for the honey, for your cucumbers. But look at the patterns and geometries and shapes in nature that inspire various types of art projects we're working on. So we've been religiously documenting the evolution of the site. What we found very quickly is we had to create a new space for making. Because now that you have a population, an abundance of materials, of wood that's otherwise being thrown away, it's a great opportunity to teach carpentry, create a shop, a greenhouse, sitting on a landscape that used to be a house. So it's another urban acupuncture installation. The lexicon and language of polycarbonate then becomes the norm. Polycarbonate from greenhouses that create space for heat, R value for us to keep the heat in while we work all year round. This is a great space for a workshop, work and shop. So creating products and education opportunities that create a new network for teaching and mentorship, intergenerational mentorship. So that product becomes a lesson plan. And then we found a very non-traditional relationship with the University of Chicago, where we were asked to do an installation with the abundance of the wood that we had been collecting, charring the wood and shifting the wood from just pine, and doing an installation about the restoring of the neighborhood. So we created an installation called the Reconstruction. of values. What was amazing is that we had our audience in a gallery and museum setting that they had stepped in before, and also concurrently the museum has expressed that they had not had our audience working in that space. So we did a 17-foot by 40-foot hand-drawing cross-sectional perspective of the facade and the reworking of this house, living sculpture inspired by our site, what then became a platform. This is actually during their trip to Chicago. It became a space, almost like a set design for humans to engage. So as we started to repopulate that space and mixing audiences and finding humans, again, this is all pre-COVID, we started to find new use for wood scraps and family days, toys, and opportunities for kids to play. And then what we found that the kids were actually designing cities and furniture and rethinking architecture, unprompted. Here's the building blocks. We the Publics is actually installation started off at the Harvard GSD during the Loeb Fellowship in a partnership with Dan Borelli and Gia Pratt, my wife. But it was interesting because that found its way from the Harvard GSD by the elevator to a gallery in the context of the building blocks installation for radical reconstruction of values. So this is storytelling, intense storytelling and remaking, and intermixing of audiences in a very productive way. So we ended up using the gallery space as a classroom with teachers, principals, others to do workshops to bring other audiences and teachers back to our site for our population, to our team, to reach out to more folks and create this productive landscape of teaching. So you'll see a recurring theme: waste to resources, changing the human infrastructure and the physical infrastructure of the site to regenerate, to create new products, to create new markets, to create new social enterprises and social entrepreneurship. So we had these products that we started doing, but then going back, how is this a lesson plan? How is it related to fractals and geometries and patterns in nature? So after we did this time and time again, we started to the products became inserted in our landscape as a new form of an installation. What's the biofeedback of that? If you put that by the tree, who's going to sit there? So we did receive funds and support from Art Place America to do a radical experiment, radical meaning of or restoring to the root. They were looking at creative placemaking. What does it mean to support new creative placemaking, which is now a hot trend. But this decision matrix around food and economic development, youth, and health, housing, this is the right thing to do, morally, ethically, like just humanitarian work, but also ecological climate crisis work. So we were identified as and supported to design the first timber frame barn in Chicago since the fire, and we hand raised it as a block party. So it's a mortise and tenon structure. We partnered with an international woodworking guild, so Trillium Dell and Mystic Vale, and it became a forum, almost like literally like an agora, as a gathering space for people to come together and play, share, dream, claim the street space, the sidewalk space. We would have block parties pre-Juneteenth. Everyone discovering Juneteenth, we were doing an annual Juneteenth celebration for our community as a thought for a hopeful future. So we reinvented what public was in a dramatically different way than what is the traditional norm just outside of the 4 contiguous city blocks that we're in. So is the epicenter, and dreaming and making and everything is the epicenter of the place. So that's the example of the barn in its more recent configuration, the Juneteenth banner. So while we were looking at it as a structure, as a design, as an opportunity and material and life cycle analysis, what that does is also, it's a reductive analysis of the building and the typology as a pavilion. By just looking at it formally, so what? It's nice, but so what? The thing that makes it actually real is the humans within it and the interpersonal, sociological, biological dynamics in the space over time at different seasons all year round. That's the energy source that is being replenished time and time again from a regenerative lens. The farm to table is not just for the select few, it's for all. An example of imagining in liminal space is dreaming. We welcomed a puppet show. So there's an international puppet show that comes in every year and uses the space. The Chicago Architecture Manual has been using the space. It's a community space to talk about the role of design and thinking about the future. Creating a space for performances. The Hyde Park Jazz Festival has been used. So every seed, like sunflower, is a seed for regeneration. So directly across the street, yet another vacant parcel. So we decided to do something for the last other such stories, architecture biennial. And again, designing based on what we've done for the ethos of the wood and the materials of the same partner, value-based partners. We designed an installation to have more competition around housing. So we made a modular house that slid on tracks in a vacant lot as a gathering space, as another pavilion, kitty corner to the barn. It was used on a regular basis, education, as a gathering space, as a shade space, as a meeting space. When we moved it from that site to the cultural center, we created a void, and we wanted to fill that void because nature does not allow voids. So we continued the conversation around workers' cottages and the housing stock from that era, from the 1860, 1890, 1900 era that is in our area that's typically foreclosed. Started a new design, understood it as an urban acupuncture installation, but as an opportunity to again use the charred wood, the stuff and language we did our partnerships with the Smart Museum, the Shosugi Bond, the techniques that we have, all different types and walks participate in. Creating public spaces in the workshop, in the alley, doing the performative work outdoors. And it was interesting how fast that landscape in a few days started to change, and embracing gathering, publicly working, intermixing audiences from different inside the community, outside the community, hand raising, trellis. Designs that start again using the same language, same lexicon of the polycarbonate. And it created a dream space of what's gonna be. But then, as we entered the new year, the reality of COVID hit. And every dream we did for starting in public was in question. As you were being quarantined, as Mayor Lightfoot came and said, we quarantine, only essential businesses can operate. Since we were an agriculture site, we were labeled an essential business. So we continued to operate, and with the same operations, but with a renewed lens. So collecting these crates and pallets and teaching deconstruction and reconstruction, but refining it. Refining our inner workings, refining the sites, refining the designs, and creating new structures to embrace any form of wood that we can get our hands on. So we decided designing new systems of doing 8 foot, 6 foot, 4 foot, 3 foot as attachments and appendages to the workshop directly. So it was interesting. It was really, really nice to do an introspection and going internal in order to rethink and dream about what the future will be. So now you can see how we now systematically embrace the wood and clean the wood and redesign the interior of the space, all the while still doing the agricultural aspect, even when it's snowing. But then again, we had the governor's decree that we don't know what's going to happen. Once that hit, we were like, wow, we need to rethink education. We need to think our spaces. What does 6 foot classroom space mean? How do we begin to use all of our spaces, the thought barn? How do we design water catchment systems and still be able to use our carpentry shop, but directly related to collections of water, planning the farm, redesigning our spaces. And so as we were continually refining, still embracing urban ecology fellows, still doing our internal local apprenticeship programs, still rethinking what does the public mean? As we were doing these spaces, a new life was starting to emerge within us, and we're starting to look at a new lens of biomimetic informatics systems, that we had a renewed love and passion for the work. And more people were showing up saying, hey, I get it now. I understand. I want to start my own garden. I want to start my own farm. I want to do this. What are you doing with the meeting house across the street? So we unveiled the meeting house as a seedling giveaway space. So families were showing up and using it as a picnic space, as a seedling pickup space, graduation space. And what emerged organically is a R&D park. The Regenerative Neighborhood Development Park, this entire space started to be used publicly for dancing, for gathering. It is absolutely amazing how the public started to shift. We embraced social distance. We still embrace our public, and we've rethought our workflows and the education and all the systems. But it's in a new form of a public. So we were preparing our lesson plans to go online, and still conducting the workshops in a new fashion, in a new way, thinking about the future, but in a much more intense, focused manner for creating new markets. More and more people show up. We still embrace the social distance. The farm intensifies. The need for the space intensifies. The market continually surges. The request for the products, the request for the education, the workshops, the request for everything just accelerated. So it's amazing how very directly and connected the market and the cooking spaces started finding their way outdoors into the public. This is Thad. This is one of our beekeepers on site, the West Side Bee Boy, and he had such an intense production because of the farm that he used our market space to sell his honey. We did custom designs for his installation. This Big Mike, one of our carpenters on site, who started looking at making canes that he does as a hobby, and it's working. What was absolutely amazing is that we were really understanding how every block is interconnected around water and energy, and the potential of the house that we reconstructed now is programmed for memory and reconstruction. So we have the gallery space as we renovated the house. We have a house right across the street for guests to stay and fellows to stay on site as a campus site that's directly tied to all of the rest of our programming. So now, as we rethink with a hopeful outlook into the future, we found one other additional property that's in our backyard. That's a church that we're getting support for rethinking it as a civic art church. So as we begin to plan our future, we're launching and unveiling the 4 contiguous city blocks and expanding as the Commonwealth, as a regenerative neighborhood development case site that has core values of regeneration: small is beautiful, chaotic, balance of chaos and order, Sankofa, reach back to be present to move forward. And a 7th generation principle that says what we do now has to matter for 7 generations ahead. And ultimately, the ethos that is open source. So what I'll do now is a soft unveil of what we're working on. This is the landscape we have. We're looking at it from above. So we have been working on Matterport, and I'm working with Virtual Vista, looking at how do we use drones and the typical tools of real estate to remap space, remap the site. So much like Google Street View, virtual tour of our site. We are updating it accordingly. So what's fascinating is that now we get to share with the general public the work that we do and have virtual tours in person. You're still connected to the audience that we've been working with for all these years. The public sign and installation lives directly on our here as the backdrop of the Think Do house. It is actually absolutely amazing what technology is available. So I'm gonna go inside the workshop. So we're learning this, and this experiment. This is not typically what you would do for a 501c3 operation that does education, and this makes perfect sense to us, all the sense in the world. So we have these virtual tours of our site. I'm going to show you more things. And as we've been rethinking the spaces, as we were rethinking the continuity of the place, lines of sight, very, very intentional lines of sight that stitch the neighborhood together. It is an acupuncture series of installations that literally reconnects the energy and the flows and the ecology of the place. We've been designing future shows to go inside of the house. But more importantly, we're looking at what happens in the barn. So we're designing a show about water and the future of water, past, present, and future, that looks at wellness at the Commonwealth. This is an in-person and remote show that transforms the space into a gallery space. This is just a quick virtual tour. Every quadrant is on premises of water and its value. We challenge to ask, where do you get the water from? How much do you drink? How much does it cost? What is needed to support yourself, your access to water? How is the water clean? But it's also a call to action in looking at the infrastructure needed for the watershed. The Great Lakes is becoming of our water, what is needed, but also from the history of redlining, and constructed ecologies of absence, like our site. What is actually needed to support the infrastructure in neighborhoods that need it the most with the dollars that are needed to support each. So we're working with a series of MacArthur Fellows and Smart Museum, and we'll be unveiling that in the near future. Talks, a series of talks. Inigo, who's is a MacArthur Fellow, working on a collaborative. He's inserted his well installation at other traveling wells. It's a well design that is the center of the barn, in the center of the barn. But we're deconstructing as an education in an art initiative that challenges you, say, well, what is a well and what is a pump house? And ultimately tie it to a vision for the future. And how we can look at pumps and wells in agriculture, education. So as we move forward into a more hopeful future, we are looking at development where houses can fit within this landscape, within this approach towards landscape development. It can connect the spaces in green of the space program were connected to all of the houses that were, they receive food, residents come to us on a regular basis that are in the surrounding footprint. But we're really thinking about how to shift the structures of consciousness. How do you reconnect the humans in the spaces of humanity to the physical spaces, to the ecological spaces, to shift the see, touch, taste, hear, smell, all of the five senses across generations? Because ultimately, it is the picture of life contrasted with the facts of life. Ideal and utopian connected with the real, which makes criticism possible. And this is the moment for that critique. This is a moment for institutional critiques. This is a moment for political critiques. This is the moment for critique, because we cannot continue forward on the path that we have. So what Frederick said so eloquently is, where there is no criticism, there is no progress. And with that, that's how we grow the neighborhood.
I'm totally blown away, which I knew I would be because we've had good conversations before. I'm very tempted to monopolize the Q&A because I have a lot of questions. But I'm going to be generous to our audience because we've received a lot of great questions, and I'm hoping that I can capture you another time to ask you all of mine. So I want to get some of our questions on the table. We have a really good one, which is that the possibility of creating a foundation like Sweetwater that expands on the conventional capitalist understanding of value is dependent on the fact that real estate is undervalued in Chicago. I would add, in certain parts of Chicago, as you demonstrated beautifully. Yeah. So how do you see a grassroots citizen-driven project taking form in cities that experience extreme overvaluation, such as the Bay Area, LA, Toronto, I would also add Boston? Yeah. Do you see alternative methods that would be viable in those cities?
Well, I mean, ironically, we've been, a lot of people from Oakland and even in San Francisco have been reaching out. We've had a 6 or 7 year conversation with folks in Oakland that are sampling from education techniques, but they're also looking at which spaces have been deemed to be public. Mm-hmm. And sadly, as tech industry has kind of monopolized the real estate and created these kind of islands, the opportunity there is definitely being lost, but there is a moral and ethical compass that is starting to be a megaphone for some opportunities to do a counterbalance, some counterbalance. We've been watching folks be pushed to the peripheries of, like, in Richmond, in California. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so that's an opportunity where people are finding each other in translating this practice to their communities. So while there is no immediate answer to the traditional patterns of market and development and the forces that 99 cents will always lose to $1 in our current structure. But we are looking at the conversation across Oakland, Detroit, New Orleans, Pittsburgh, and what lessons are being learned now, because this is a critical time for knowledge formation about the strategies for public spaces to be a stronghold and a strong, like just to clamp down and to publicly make the issues visible.
What about other parts of Chicago itself, or the suburbs around Chicago? In other words, parts of Chicago are overvalued compared to Englewood.
Completely.
And so have you had more local populations try and reach out to you for using Sweetwater as a model?
Yeah, okay. So Sweetwater is directly in the epicenter of 7 neighborhoods that are all historically struggling from municipal disinvestment. So Bronzeville, Englewood, Washington Park, Auburn, Gresham, Chatham, but all of which have ties to residents that are either in the far south or on the west side, and or have been either forced removed, lost. There's a lot of eviction and the closing of public housing. There was vouchers that sent people to the south suburbs. So we've had the mayors from Dalton, we've had the mayors from the south suburbs show up. But it's interesting, as we do more installations that touch a wider range of the moral compass, we have folks from Oak Park. We have folks from, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's food, it's natural resources, it's natural capital. And we've been finding the right humans that say, well, this is a great opportunity to translate your lessons learned with the team to do an installation, to meet more people, to accelerate the infrastructure in the suburbs. So we're finding this urban kind of rural continuum. So the urban, the peri-urban, it's emerging. We just don't know what to do with it yet, but.
That ties into another question that we got, which is that the foundation leverages its current scale for maintaining community involvement and effectiveness with, even if it's 7 neighborhoods, it's still sort of, it holds to that direct community outreach.
Yeah.
If the city of Chicago were to grant the foundation more of the local property, or I would argue more of a local voice, a greater voice, how much larger could Sweetwater get without losing its efficiency or efficacy?
Fantastic question.
Is it?
Yeah, it is. It's appropriate because small is beautiful, and the production of local. What is the production of local that is at the appropriate scale that locality can remain as a local force? It inevitably gets kind of watered down and muted out as you go up in scale, if it becomes kind of a monolithic approach. But what we've been trying to reinforce is a dialogic framework. So we have a small scale network that is over in one area doing their interpretation for their block, for their locality. Then we have another group that's over connected. And so what we've created is a series of weekly value-based partner calls. So we stay connected, and we are not trying to by any means control each of the network. They have an adaptive response that works with us. As we get funds, quite honestly, we offer micro funds to support those other various enterprises. But I mean, it's an issue of scale. And how do you deal with this? I mean, and translation, we're listed as a tourist site now. So people will just show up from anywhere. And there's a constant challenge of the translation of the work and not being able to be focused on the work, but still being inclusive.
Do you ever have to turn people away from an event because you have too many people there?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially now.
It's a tough problem for you. Well, yeah, especially now.
Especially now.
There are a couple questions I want to get at because there are 2 different questions that engage the question of architecture. One saying, do you think architecture is part of the solution or is secondary or even inconsequential? I hope not. I mean, that's an editorial comment from me. In comparison with the activities. And so that's one question. And then another question is saying, what is more important for the successful outcome of the project, the architectural design of the building or intervention, or the political engagement and organization behind its execution? So both of those are similar
Yeah.
questions.
So the intentionality of the design is everything. The materiality of what's accessible, just to have people understand that things are possible. And the design build challenge of doing something that shifts the conversation has been 100% the role of architecture for us. So you'll see things that are more pavilion-like than finished buildings, simply because there has not been to this date political will to allow for us to actually even get water access building permits. So the product, it's an interesting existential crisis within architecture and the profession here, because sadly, there's very limited architects that actually support the work. However, in the education frame, we have all of the support, which is beautiful. And then so it is creating an accountability framework for political will to then show up and actually support. But the space that's created is to just let us do what we need to do. And it's not beholden to numbers, which is usually the reductive thing. It's not beholden to how many jobs and how many, the typical pound per square, it's not beholden to that. It's much more of a qualitative support that we need.
Yeah, so I hope all the architects in the audience who are in Chicago, or if you know any architects in Chicago, I hope that you got that underlying message from Emmanuel that they could use a little more architectural engagement at Sweetwater. I hear that. So that parallels a question asking, what do you believe governments should play? What role do you believe government should play in regenerative neighborhood planning? How can the city's involvement change the dynamics of this project? So you have very strong community development.
Right.
And I guess the question is, what about the other direction?
Fortunately, for the first time since we've been on the site in 2014, we have an alderwoman. When I say that, because our previous alderman is incarcerated now for federal. Yes, very Chicago. So our current political will locally has been everything for us. There has been an alignment saying, you all do the work and you all in the collective community have the authorship and you tell me what I need to do to support. That is starting to find its way into the Common Council, into the bigger picture, saying, well, what do you need next? How can we support it? That's been extremely helpful. Yes, there are architects that come in that might do the volunteer work, but now there is the built environment work, the permitting, the design of the housing, the actual physical structures, and in how it's integrated into a local workforce. That's been a challenge. Because a lot of times traditional development has to be at scale with a certain time of ROI, but it's starting to shift, and the locality is being produced in a way that we're creating interfaces that allow for the professions to really actively support. There's an engineering need, there's a public health analysis, how does it fit within the water infrastructure? I mean, these are at that scale of development, you have to have this cohesion across the board.
So I'm going to ask the last question. I'm going to steal you for the last question for myself, which is, so you jumped into this project, or as you said, and I like the term, life's work, pretty quickly after graduating from Columbia. And what would you advise the school in terms of curriculum? Because let's go back to what you called the landscapes of pedagogical modes. You are surfing across politics, economics, ecology, real estate, education, history. It was a really nice snapshot of Chicago's real estate history. What would you say to the Emmanuel Pratt who was looking at course offerings when you were a student? What courses would you want to take that you didn't take?
the #1 course that we've started at the Sweetwater Academy that has been the resounding outlier for most universities is urban ecology.
Yeah.
It is the transdisciplinary course that intersects across everything. And for whatever reason, the built environment being reduced to $1 single bottom line has never fully embraced urban ecology and transdisciplinary trajectory. So particularly architecture in the built environment. I had no, at Cornell, I had no urban ecology framework. At Columbia, even in the urban planning department, when I was introducing what I want to do for my doctorate, I was kind of told that it was too based in the real world. It didn't have, it had been done before, various forms of gardening had been done before, but there was no food systems planning. There was no food systems analysis and food systems, of course. So, but urban ecology is not just being, yeah, it's everything. But we have a lot of students that struggle saying, I don't know what the pathway to get out of to get my degree that allow for me to do, one, the hands-on work, to do the design build, and also to do, this is another challenge though. If you are doing something for 1 semester and it creates data, that data then gets lost and does not have a chance to become information if it's just 1 semester.
Yeah.
If you're doing something over time, it becomes data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. And I feel like there hasn't been allowed for a continuity framework that allows for those interdisciplinary fields to really support work on the ground in an honest, meaningful way. It's just more procedural knowledge, if you will, and it never lets you get to tacit knowledge.
That's beautifully put. Maybe I'll hire you as assistant dean. So I really want to thank you. I mean, I think that you speak with such ease across so many disciplines, and you've accomplished so much across many different worlds, let's say, within that life's work or project. And yet I know that it's an incredibly challenging place to be running and expanding and having so much outreach on so many different people. And so I want to thank you for what you're doing there, but also thank you for taking us through it so seamlessly.
Again, I want to thank you for creating the space for this dialogue to even happen, because it's not often that I'm even asked to share. And I'm excited about your new role and the trajectory and future of the GSD, because it's got some reconciliation on its hands. Yeah.
We'll work. I look forward to talking more with you, and I want to thank you again for today and thank our audience. Terrific questions, and join us in our additional programs starting again on Saturday. Okay.
I'm also happy to offer us as a case study moving forward, for the record.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks, Emmanuel. Talk to you soon.
Thanks.